As the Carry On films reached their climax, they became almost caricatures of themselves and coarsened, and the last one, which I know Kenneth thought was appalling, was Carry On Emmanuel. He was quite embarrassed to have done it, but he did it out of loyalty to the Carry On team, Carry On Emmanuel.
The film work had dried up, the stage work had dried up, the Kenneth Williams Presents on BBC television, or whatever it might be, that had kind of gone. And he had become that most forlorn of creatures. He'd become the person who existed because of game shows and talk shows.
So from an enormous potential, he had reduced himself, boxed himself into a corner. And in a way, the same thing, I think, happened with his, in a sense, much of his private life. He alienated his friends as the years went by outrageous behavior. I mean, I remember being in the sitting room and he'd kept the table on a raw for several hours, but he had to go further. And the next thing we knew, there he was, literally dropping his trousers and saying, you know, the bum, it's hanging down in pleats, and exposing it. So I think maybe in terms of relationships, he painted himself into a corner, and fewer people were phoning back.
And the one relationship that had always worked was also disintegrating, as old age took its toll on Louis.
I'm virtually a prisoner, chained to this elderly derelict, forever reminded of geriatric problems, the stained mattress, the cigarette burns on carpets and chairs, the conversational repetition.
I think that he'd got to a stage where Lou had become a great burden to him. What had been a great friendship and a lot of fun when it was an evenly balanced relationship had become almost like an albatross. I mean, the fact that Lou was becoming incontinent, that he had to do everything for her, that he was feeling pretty ill himself physically, and the fact that the work just wasn't coming as it used to, I think, conspired to depress Kenneth to the point that it did.
Kenneth himself wasn't a well man. Stomach ulcers, piles, bowel disorders, all contributed to physical pain he found hard to take.
Walks became more and more infrequent, and when we did go for walks, he would sort of say, "Oh, don't walk so fast. I'm really in pain." What should have taken half an hour would take an hour and a half.
Even this level of suffering was incorporated into his act.
If something is misery-making, turn it, talk about it, make it amusing, make it funny, make it creative, explain why the illness, the malaise occurs. And you can do that with comedy.
He was taking things that were personal and sometimes painful to him, you know, his ailments, his strange voice, his curious manner, and almost sending them up, or not almost, sending them up, so that he was inviting you to laugh at him while he was actually telling you something true about himself.
Mr. Williams, you have a spastic colon. So I've come into money.
But he would pay a price for this public exposure.
Oh, the fact is, on these chat shows, I've been eating at myself for years, just living off body fat. And people say, all he does now is go on and tell those old stories we've all heard before, with his usual lavatory gags and his camp leather. Pathetic.
He felt he was excavating himself in those chat shows, just giving more chunks of himself away. And I think he felt there wasn't much left of himself.
He'd say, "Oh, I long to be dead." He said, "I've had enough of this world." He said, "The pain, the agony, I can't stand it anymore, you know." And I said, "Well, don't talk so silly." I said, "What about all your friends?" And he said, "Well, yes, I'll miss them, but," he said, "you don't understand, mate." He said, "The pain is really crippling me."
William's diaries record he had mused on suicide from his earliest days, but in the last few months of his life, the idea of putting an end to his suffering began to obsess him.
What do you mean, like, say, you'd want to kill yourself or something like that?
Oh, yes, I put stuff like down about suicide and how one would go about it, what would be the best method, and all that kind of thing, you know. Looking back on it, of course, it's often, you know, quite amusing.
Why do you think you want to kill yourself?
Well, one would think it at the time because of extremely low state of morale. And one actually does write something down which is practical in terms of how one thinks one should go about it.
Counted my capsules of poison, and I've got over 30, so there should be enough to kill me. Just have to work out the time and the place.
A fortnight before he died, I saw him outside Broadcasting House, and we stood on a traffic island. He was very distressed, and he looked sort of grey, and Kenneth's face in repose sometimes was an incredibly tragic face, and he would go very sallow, and I remember thinking, I was so preoccupied with my own things, and I remember thinking, oh, I should ring him, but I didn't.
On March 21st, 1988, William's diaries reveal that he attempted an overdose, but after taking 2 barbiturates, couldn't go through with it. On April 14th, he wrote what was to be his final entry in his diary.
Had meal with Lou at 5:30. Saw the news, watched the dreary saga of murder and mayhem. By 6:30, pain in the back was pulsating as it's never done before. So this, plus the stomach trouble, combines to torture me. Oh, what's the bloody point?
The next day, Louis went into her son's flat and found him dead in his bed.
The comedy actor Kenneth Williams has died at the age of 62. He was found dead at his flat in North London this morning.
He died from an overdose of barbiturates, causing much speculation in the press. But the coroner couldn't be sure it wasn't an accident and recorded an open verdict.
It was, if you like, I think a generous verdict. Probably there was doubt in their minds and they just went for the verdict that was the most neutral. It's possible when you've taken a lot of alcohol that you take a lot of pills, I suppose, by mistake. This has happened, but I'm sure it didn't happen to him. This was a perfectly willed act, which he'd contemplated several times at different stages over the weeks beforehand.
I believe that he took his life. That is what I believe. I don't know that for sure, but I believe so. He could not find anything worthy in himself at all. He felt that his life was dross.
At the end of the day, he died, I think, of frustration, really. Sexual, social, theatrical, professional. He just wasn't doing what he wanted to do.
Left neatly stacked in William's bookcase was his final legacy. The 41 volumes that documented his innermost thoughts about himself and everyone who came into his orbit, candid and uncensored.
You say you're not going to want them published after your death. I'm surprised to hear you say that. I'd have thought you might have thought you'd want your diaries published after your death.
Oh, I see. Oh, after death?
Yes.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you meant published during lifetime.
Oh, no.
Oh, after death. Yes, one wouldn't mind that at all.
Wouldn't you worry about being unkind or catty?
Well, I wouldn't care at all then. One would be out of the way. I wouldn't mind it. And then saying, oh, well, he was a rotter, to say a nasty thing like that. I wouldn't mind at all if I was out of the way. That's fine.
He knew that he'd been a strange and somewhat dislocated personality all his life. Since a child he'd known that, and he'd never managed quite to puzzle it out for himself. But I think he wanted to leave the evidence so that it was there on the table, literally on the table, for us to see and sort out.
La plume de ma tante. C'est la vie, ma crêpe Suzette.
I feel sad for him that his life wasn't as happy for him as he made it for all of us. Because as soon as you saw him, as soon as you heard him, your heart lifted, you broke into a smile, and sometimes into a belly laugh. He had the gift of creating laughter, but he didn't have the gift of creating it for himself.
Par avion, peux-tu le clair? Fiancés ensemble, lorgneux de lingerie et de toilette, gauloise cigarette, entourage ma crêpe Suzette.